On the 8th of November 1942, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot photographed what his intelligence officers believed to be an empty field near El Alamein. The ground below showed nothing but desert scrub and scattered shadows. 3 days later, that same empty field erupted with 300 British tanks that smashed through the Afrika Korps positions at Tel El Akakir. The German armoured units, positioned to counter an expected thrust from the south, were caught completely out of position. What the reconnaissance photographs had actually shown wasn't an empty field at all. It was the concentrated striking force of the British XSSX Corps, hidden beneath what military planners called concealment garnish, but what soldiers simply knew as the bloody nets with leaves stuck on them. This wasn't photographic failure. This was the result of Britain developing the most sophisticated camouflage doctrine in military history, one that turned the new science of aerial reconnaissance, Germany's supposed technological advantage, into a liability that cost them battles. The paradox seemed absurd. Germany had pioneered military aerial photography, invested millions in camera technology and photo interpretation training, and could put reconnaissance aircraft over British positions almost at will in the North African campaign. Britain's response wasn't to build better fighters or develop radar-guided anti-aircraft guns. Instead, they parked their tanks under nets decorated with leaves, painted false shadows on canvas, and spent thousands of man-hours arranging hessian and chicken wire. On paper, this was Victorian theatrecraft facing 20th century technology. Critics in the War Office called it arts and crafts nonsense that diverted resources from actual combat preparation. Yet by 1943, German intelligence consistently overestimated British strength in some areas by 200%, whilst completely missing entire armoured divisions in others. The nets didn't just hide tanks, they weaponised the very precision of German reconnaissance against them. What made this work wasn't that British camouflage was particularly clever at hiding things. It was that British doctrine understood something fundamental about how aerial reconnaissance actually worked. The camera doesn't lie, but the human brain interpreting the photograph absolutely does. And if you understood that brain better than your enemy did, you could make him see exactly what you wanted him to see. Standard military thinking in the late 1930s emphasized aerial reconnaissance as the decisive intelligence-gathering tool of modern warfare. Germany had invested heavily in this capability. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance units flew specialized variants of the Heinkel, E-11-1 and Junkers Ju-88, equipped with Zeiss RB-50/30 and RB-75/30 cameras, precision instruments that could capture images from 7,600 meters with resolution fine enough to distinguish individual vehicles. German photo interpreters trained for 18 months at dedicated schools in Hildesheim and Kiel, learning to identify vehicle types from shadows, track marks, and the distinctive heat signatures that appeared on infrared film. By 1941, Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft were producing over 1.3 million photographs annually. The intelligence officers analysing these images worked in climate-controlled rooms with stereoscopic viewers, measuring equipment and comprehensive reference libraries showing every Allied vehicle type from multiple angles. The British couldn't match this. The RAF's photographic reconnaissance units flew converted Spitfires with hastily mounted F-24 cameras that frequently jammed in cold weather. Training for photo interpreters lasted 8 weeks, not 18 months. The entire British camouflage effort in 1940 consisted of roughly 40 officers, mostly recruited from civilian life, artists, stage designers, and one rather bemused professor of zoology named Hugh Cott, who'd written a textbook about animal camouflage patterns. When these officers proposed systematic deception operations, senior commanders were skeptical. Major General Bernard Montgomery, then commanding V Corps, wrote in a June 1940 memo, "Camouflage is useful for static installations. Mobile forces defeat reconnaissance through speed and dispersion, not through hiding." Yet what actually mattered wasn't the quality of the cameras or the sophistication of the analysis. It was understanding the fundamental limitations built into the reconnaissance process itself. German photo interpretation doctrine, inherited from First World War practice, trained analysts to look for specific signatures, vehicle shapes, track patterns, tent layouts, and supply dumps. They learned to recognize these patterns quickly and accurately. What they weren't trained to recognize was when those patterns had been deliberately fabricated. The German system was optimized for finding things that were trying not to be found. It had no framework for handling things that wanted to be found in the wrong place. The secret was in understanding that aerial reconnaissance wasn't a camera problem, it was a cognitive problem. Squadron leader Geoffrey Barkas, appointed to command the British Camouflage Development and Training Centre in November 1940, had spent 15 years as a film director. He understood that fooling a camera was trivially easy. What was difficult was fooling the brain of someone who'd been trained to interpret what they saw through that camera. His first report to the War Office laid out the challenge. The German interpreter isn't looking at reality. He's looking at a black and white photograph taken from 7,000 meters, likely at an oblique angle, possibly through haze or cloud, under lighting conditions he can't control. He has perhaps 30 seconds to interpret each frame before moving to the next one. He isn't asking, is this real? He's asking, do I recognize this pattern? Our job is to give him patterns he recognizes, in places where we want him to see them. This wasn't accidental. British camouflage doctrine, formalized in the Classified Manual Concealment and Deception in Land Warfare, April 1941, explicitly rejected the idea that camouflage meant hiding. Instead, it defined camouflage as controlling what the enemy sees. That seemingly subtle distinction changed everything. You weren't trying to make your tanks invisible. You were trying to make your tanks look like something else, whilst making something else look like your tanks. The goal wasn't absence from the photograph, but rather strategic management of what appeared in it. Consider what a German photo interpreter actually saw when examining reconnaissance photographs of British positions. From 7,600 meters, the standard altitude for Luftwaffe reconnaissance over defended territory, a Churchill tank measured approximately 1.2 millimeters on the developed negative. The interpreter examined this through a stereoscopic viewer at 6 times magnification, bringing it to roughly 7 millimeters. At this scale, individual features like turret hatches, track links, or unit markings were invisible. What remained visible were shapes, shadows, and patterns. The German recognition system relied on a comprehensive catalogue of these patterns. Interpreters memorized the distinctive rectangular shape of a Churchill tank, 7.44 meters long, 2.44 meters wide, the characteristic shadow it cast at different times of day, and the spacing patterns of British armoured formations. Tanks typically spaced 25 to 30 meters apart in defensive positions. They'd been trained on thousands of example photographs. When they saw that pattern, rectangular shape, appropriate shadow, correct spacing, they marked it as Churchill tank, high confidence. What made British camouflage work wasn't sophisticated optical illusion. It was exploiting the interpreter's need to work quickly. A typical reconnaissance sortie over British positions in North Africa produced 200 to 400 photographs. Intelligence officers needed results within 6 hours, often faster if the photographs showed signs of enemy preparation for offensive operations. Each photograph received perhaps 45 seconds of examination. The interpreter couldn't afford to be uncertain. He had to make rapid decisions based on pattern recognition. The British gave him the patterns he expected, in the wrong locations. A proper camouflage installation for a tank didn't try to make the tank invisible. Instead, it presented an ambiguous pattern, something that might be a tank, or might be a supply lorry, or might be a tent, or might be a shadow cast by terrain. Simultaneously, several kilometers away, dummy tanks, constructed from hessian stretched over scaffolding frames, presented an unambiguous pattern, definitely a tank, high confidence. The dummy tanks were remarkably crude when examined at close range. A typical Mark I dummy, introduced in July 1941, consisted of a timber frame covered with painted hessian. The total materials cost was £15. It took 4 men 4 hours to construct and could be assembled on site in 30 minutes. At ground level, these dummies wouldn't fool anyone beyond about 100 meters. The hessian rippled in the wind. The gun barrel was obviously a pole. There were no tracks on the ground beneath them. From 7,600 meters, they were perfect. The shape matched. The shadow matched. British camouflage units included what they called shadow officers, usually former theatrical lighting designers, who calculated exactly where shadows should fall at different times of day, and painted false shadows onto the ground using a mixture of asphalt and crude oil. The spacing matched British doctrine. Most critically, the pattern was unambiguous. The German interpreter, working under time pressure, marked it as Churchill tank high confidence and moved on to the next photograph. Meanwhile, the actual Churchill tank sat beneath what appeared, from 7,600 meters, to be terrain features. The camouflage nets used by British forces from 1941 onwards measured 12 meters by 18 meters and weighed 47 kilograms. They consisted of a wire mesh base onto which operators wove strips of hessian in patterns matching the local terrain. In desert environments, this meant sand-coloured hessian interspersed with darker browns to simulate rocks and shadows. Critically, the nets weren't laid flat. They were suspended 2.4 to 3 meters above the vehicles on poles, creating an air gap that prevented the vehicle's shape from showing through whilst allowing the net to cast its own shadow pattern. The garnish, leaves, branches, or in desert conditions, actual scrub vegetation cut from nearby, broke up the net's artificial regularity. From above, what the camera captured wasn't a net covering a tank. It captured what appeared to be a slightly darker patch of terrain, with a scattered, irregular shadow pattern of natural vegetation. The German interpreter, looking for the distinctive rectangular shape of a Churchill tank with its characteristic shadow, didn't see it. Pattern recognition failed. He marked the area as terrain, no military significance, and moved on. The first major test of British camouflage doctrine came during the Battle of Alamein, 30th of August to 5th September 1942. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel planned to repeat his previous successes. A feint at the northern section of the British line, followed by a rapid armoured thrust through the southern desert, then a sweeping hook north to encircle British forces. German intelligence, based on reconnaissance photographs taken between the 24th and 29th of August, identified the British Armoured Reserve, approximately 200 tanks of the 22nd Armoured Brigade positioned near Alamein Ridge. What the photographs had actually shown were the dummies. The real 22nd Armoured Brigade, comprising 156 Grant tanks and 108 Crusader tanks, sat concealed 12 kilometers north under camouflage nets, positioned to block exactly the route Rommel intended to use. The dummy tanks near Alamein Ridge were deliberately positioned in terrain that would be difficult for German armour to assault directly, adding to the deception's credibility. When Rommel's armoured spearhead, the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, totalling approximately 200 operational tanks, executed their attack on the night of the 30th of August, they advanced confidently through the southern desert. Their intelligence told them British armour was positioned well to the north. They expected to complete their envelopment before encountering serious opposition. Instead, at 08:27 hours on the 31st of August, lead elements of the 21st Panzer Division came under fire from hull-down positions along a ridge they'd been told was lightly defended. Within 40 minutes they'd lost 22 tanks, knocked out by the Grant tanks of the 22nd Armoured Brigade, which had moved into position during the night. A captured German intelligence officer, interrogated on the 2nd of September, later stated, "The reconnaissance photographs showed clearly that British armour was concentrated near Alamein. We had excellent photographs, taken at low altitude with perfect visibility. How this position could have been evacuated and moved 12 kilometers north without aerial observation is impossible to understand. The British hadn't moved the tanks. They'd never been where the German photographs showed them. Captain Geoffrey Barkas, observing from a command post, later wrote, "The Germans had perfect intelligence about our dispositions. Unfortunately for them, all of it was wrong. Not because our camouflage was invisible, it wasn't, but because we'd made our lies more visible than the truth. The battle cost Rommel 49 tanks destroyed and 55 damaged, losses the Afrika Korps couldn't replace. British losses were 18 tanks destroyed." More significantly, Rommel's confidence in his intelligence apparatus had been shattered. Post-battle analysis by German intelligence noted extensive gaps in their reconnaissance coverage and questioned whether British forces had developed some new form of portable concealment system. They were looking for a technological solution. The answer was canvas, paint and theatre craft. What made this work wasn't any single clever trick, but rather a systematic doctrine that integrated camouflage into every aspect of military operations. British forces didn't camouflage tanks after positioning them. They planned positions based on what could be effectively camouflaged. The difference seems subtle but was profound. Consider Operation Bertram, the camouflage plan for the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Richardson, Montgomery's chief of plans, needed to concentrate XXXX Corps, comprising 600 tanks and their supporting vehicles, for an assault through the northern sector of the German line. The concentration area measured approximately 8 square kilometers. Concealing this mass of vehicles seemed impossible. German reconnaissance aircraft flew over British positions daily, often multiple times. Richardson's solution wasn't to hide the concentration. Instead, he created it gradually over 3 weeks, while simultaneously creating the impression that British armour was moving south. The technique relied on what camouflage officers called sun shield. Each tank, as it moved into the northern concentration area, was immediately parked beneath a wooden framework covered with hessian painted to resemble a supply lorry. From above, the reconnaissance photographs showed the usual background traffic of supply vehicles moving forward, nothing suggesting an armoured concentration. Simultaneously, 600 dummy tanks appeared in the southern sector. These weren't created overnight. That would have been suspicious. Instead, they appeared gradually over the same 3-week period, with new tanks appearing each night. German reconnaissance photographed this build-up daily. Intelligence officers tracked the growing concentration, estimating British armoured strength in the southern sector at approximately 500 to 600 tanks by late October. The deception went beyond visual trickery. British signals units established dummy radio nets in the southern sector, transmitting the characteristic patterns of armoured brigade communications. Actual tank units in the north maintained radio silence. German signals intelligence, cross-referencing with aerial reconnaissance, confirmed the assessment. British armour was concentrating for an attack in the south. The technical details of the sunshield concealment revealed the sophistication of British thinking. The wooden frameworks weren't random constructions. They were precisely engineered to specific dimensions. A Churchill tank measuring 7.44 metres long and 3.45 metres tall required a sunshield measuring 8.2 metres long, 2.4 metres wide, and 2.8 metres tall to simulate a standard British 3-ton lorry at reconnaissance altitudes. The height difference was critical. Too low, and the framework would show the tank's bulk. Too high, and the shadow pattern would be wrong for a lorry. Each sunshield took 6 men 3 hours to construct. The camouflage effort for Operation Bertram required 1,800 sunshield frameworks, consuming 980 tons of timber, 7,000 litres of paint, and 34,000 square metres of hessian. The construction program employed 3,100 men working round the clock for 3 weeks. Critics in the War Office questioned whether this effort, equivalent to building a small town, was worth diverting resources from actual combat preparations. The answer came at 21:40 hours on the 23rd of October 1942, when Montgomery launched his assault. The German defenders, positioned to repel an attack from the south, found themselves facing 600 British tanks attacking through the northern sector. The Afrika Korps' mobile reserves, positioned 40 kilometers south based on intelligence assessments, required 8 hours to redeploy. By the time they reached the breakthrough point, British forces had advanced 12 kilometers and established defensive positions. Captured German records from the intelligence staff of the Panzer Army Africa revealed the scale of the deception. Daily reconnaissance reports from the 1st to the 23rd of October consistently placed British armoured strength at 500 to 600 tanks, southern sector, with estimated 150 to 200 tanks, northern sector, mostly dispersed. The actual distribution was exactly reversed. A German intelligence summary dated 25th October noted, "All previous estimates of British positions must be considered unreliable. Current vehicle locations cannot be determined from aerial reconnaissance with acceptable confidence." Lieutenant Fritz Behling, a photo interpretation officer captured after the battle, explained the German perspective during interrogation. "We had excellent photographs, perfect visibility, low altitude, using the best cameras in the world. We could see individual vehicles clearly. What we saw was 600 tanks in the south and supply lorries in the north. How were we to know that the tanks were stage props and the lorries were tanks? You don't interpret photographs by assuming everything you see is a deliberate lie. That would make intelligence gathering impossible." He was right, of course. That was exactly the problem. German reconnaissance had become too good, their interpretation methods too refined. They'd optimized for finding things that were hiding. British camouflage gave them things that weren't hiding at all, things that were shouting, "I'm here," in exactly the wrong locations. By 1943, British camouflage operations had become an industrial enterprise. The Camouflage Development and Training Centre at Farnham produced approximately 15,000 camouflage nets per month. The Royal Engineers camouflage companies expanded from 3 companies in 1940 to 23 companies by 1943, employed 4,800 personnel. Dummy tank production reached 400 units per month, manufactured at dedicated facilities in Birmingham and Leicester. This wasn't arts and crafts anymore. It was factory production with standardized specifications. A Mark III dummy tank, introduced in January 1943, came with assembly instructions, numbered components, and could be erected by 4 men in 18 minutes. The pneumatic dummy tanks developed for Operation Fortitude, the D-Day deception, could be inflated in 4 minutes and, when properly positioned and garnished, were indistinguishable from actual Sherman tanks at reconnaissance altitudes. The Germans never matched this industrial approach. Luftwaffe reconnaissance continued improving their cameras and training, but they were solving the wrong problem. Better cameras just meant better photographs of things that weren't real. More sophisticated interpretation methods just meant more confident assessments that were completely wrong. The principle that made it work was understanding that modern warfare was fought in the enemy commander's head as much as on the battlefield. Field Marshal Montgomery, who'd been skeptical of camouflage in 1940, wrote in August 1943, "Every major operation must now begin with the assumption that the enemy will photograph our positions. Intelligence officers must consider not only what we want to hide, but what we want the enemy to see. The question isn't, can we conceal our intentions? It's what false intentions can we make him believe?" This wasn't revolutionary technology defeating obsolete methods. This was theatrecraft and basic psychology, weaponizing the enemy's most advanced intelligence-gathering capability against them. The nets with leaves stuck on them worked because they understood something fundamental. The camera never lies, but the brain interpreting the photograph lies to itself constantly. And if you understood how that brain worked, what patterns it was trained to recognize, what conclusions it was predisposed to reach, what pressures forced it to make quick decisions, you could feed it exactly the lies it wanted to believe. British tanks hiding under nets covered with leaves weren't invisible. They were just less visible than the obvious fakes positioned exactly where German intelligence expected to find them, and that was all that mattered. The reconnaissance photographs showed empty fields because the interpreters were looking at fields full of real tanks while staring at fields full of obvious fakes. The most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world was reporting with high confidence that the sky was green and grass was blue, because someone had understood how they looked through a camera and decided what they wanted to see. That was the secret. Not better hiding, but better lying. Not avoiding detection, but controlling what was detected. The Germans had the advantage of superior technology, right up until British commanders realised that superior technology just meant superior confidence and completely wrong conclusions. After that, every Luftwaffe reconnaissance sortie, every carefully interpreted photograph, every confident intelligence assessment just dug the hole deeper. The more they looked, the less they saw. The better their cameras got, the more convincing the lies became. Battlefields aren't won by the side with better equipment. They're won by the side that better understands how their enemy uses that equipment and how to turn that use against them.